months, we are looking at the full range of nuclear questions that face us in the UK, both defence and civil. We'll be looking we're looking at the past, the present, and the future, domestic and international. And I'm very pleased that this is the first public session we've done under the rubric of the Commission. John Fingleton here to join us. I'm pretty sure everybody in this room will already be familiar with his work. The Nuclear Regulatory Taskforce, which you chaired last year, is the main topic of conversation, but of course you did that after a long and distinguished career so far in all matters regulatory, having chaired the Competition Authority in Ireland and been Chief Executive of the OFT. No better man to investigate what more can be done to improve the regulatory environment for nuclear here in the UK. The way we're going to run this is I'm going to let John say a few bits and pieces to start with, and then we'll have a conversation picking up some of the key themes in the report, and then I'll make sure there are time for questions from in the room and online. So without further ado, John, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon, for the kind remarks. When people say long and distinguished career, and then you said so far, which is very nice. I thought maybe there's a bit more left. I'm going to say something under three headings. First, just talk a little bit about the process of the task force. Secondly, something about our recommendations. And thirdly, something about implementation. On the process, I was approached last February to do this. It then took about 2 months for the government to actually announce it publicly, and another month for them to appoint other task force members. So I didn't really get off the ground until May. I was very lucky in that the other task force members who had deep expertise in both nuclear and on environmental and planning stuff were so good and so up for change and being radical, because they might not have been, but people with between them over 100 years experience on various aspects of nuclear energy. We had 2 public consultations, a call for evidence in April, May last year, and then we put out a statement of the problems as they were described to us in August, and asked for further submissions back. We had over 100 engaged parties. I think it's important to emphasize that, because there's quite a lot of criticism that we haven't listened to some people, but in fact we did listen to the people. I think the concerns are often that we didn't agree with what they'd said, or that they hadn't provided evidence, but that's a different point. But we had a very inclusive process. But it was quite demanding to, we were asked to do something in 6 months. We were asked to look at defence, new build, extension of life of existing nuclear facilities, and decommissioning. So there's quite a lot in there. And we were asked to look at planning, environment, nuclear safety, so the full range of regulations that affect nuclear. So potentially quite big. So the report is necessarily not detailed on every single subject, but it tries to set a very clear direction of travel for where we need to go to get regulatory costs down. We were also very clear in our own minds, and we state this in the report, that we did not see our job as being advocates of nuclear, but our job was really to examine the regulatory costs of nuclear. People can take their own views on that, but we didn't think it was helpful for us to be trying to do that as well, because simply making the argument that the sector is badly regulated, over-regulated, or regulation works badly was, I think, sufficient, and we didn't need to make those arguments. Others are really well placed to make those arguments. But interestingly, if you'd asked me this time last year what I thought about nuclear, I might have said, I think it's very expensive, and I don't have any other strong views on it. I might have said, I think it's becoming more relevant in the defence context, but it wasn't something I'd occupied my mind with. And I think that was one of the reasons I was asked to do this, because I was coming to it relatively agnostically. I obviously knew quite a bit about regulation, but I obviously, you can't work on this for 7, 8 months, 9 months and not have a view. And I did warm very much to nuclear as I did it, because I could see the benefits. But it does have to come down in cost, and it has to come down in cost quite substantially to really move the dial. And so it makes what we with it all the more relevant. In terms of our recommendations, I think when we were asked to look at this, the background context was statements by the government about regulation holding back economic growth and regulators holding back economic growth. I think when we looked at this, we discovered that the picture was more complex and more systemic. There are problems within and between the regulators, and we've identified those. But there are even bigger problems with the laws and regulations under which those regulators operate. And very often it's easy to blame the regulator when in actual fact the underlying problem is a political one. And then I think we're reasonably clear about this. We think there's quite big problems within government in terms of top-down drive and determination, the ability to drive decisions through, the problem of hyper-minority engagement on specific issues that holds things up. So we thought that government could be clearer and more decisive. And then I think we thought that industry bore quite a lot of the responsibility for some of the cost overruns. In the defence sector, with the exception of the Rolls-Royce, I think it might be called Velocity. I keep forgetting the name of it. The contract Rolls-Royce has for the reactors in the submarines, with the exception of that, everybody in the defence sector is on a cost-plus contract, and both Hinckley and Sizewell have similar features that ultimately cost overruns get picked up by the taxpayer or by the consumer. You can dispute the fine detail of that, but essentially that's the environment you operate. And in that environment, if you're a regulatory director and you face a choice between a quiet life for a gold-plated regulatory solution, or a choice between engaging with the regulator, being tough, and getting costs down, it's not obvious which way your incentives are aligned. And so one of the central recommendations of our report was that actually the Chancellor engage with the companies in the industry to put a lot of pressure on them to think about the culture within the industry. We found lots of examples where decisions were taken early on by junior engagement, by people not thinking about the overall costs, had massive consequences 5-10 years later when people realised what they'd committed to. The water intake system at Hinckley being a very good example of that. That it's difficult to blame EDF or the regulators. It really is a systemic problem, but it was at its core. It was decisions taken by junior people a long time ago that contributed to a lot of that. So our recommendations focus on nuclear safety, where we have, I think, got ourselves to a stage where we're between 1/10 and 100 of the international relevant limits. It's way more risky to go to a dentist and have an x-ray than it is to do anything in the nuclear power facility. On the environmental regulation, where I think in common with so much of other infrastructure, we have created the situation where we've created trade-offs between building things and saving the environment that are artificial in my view. We are far from the frontier, but we're on the frontier, or we appear to be on the frontier because the processes make it so. And so we might come back to that in the discussion. And then, unlike other infrastructure, with nuclear, everything else comes at a higher cost. So if you've got an asbestos issue or another health and safety issue, or a panel falls off a building, if it's in a nuclear power facility, it's just much more expensive to deal with. So we've made recommendations on culture within the industry, culture within the regulators, changes to laws and regulations on environmental and planning, and changes to guidance on nuclear safety. One of the really important recommendations is on the semi-urban population density criteria. We have this quite crazy rule on where nuclear power stations can be. And Heysham, north of Liverpool, would fail that test at the moment, even though what would replace it would be safer than Heysham. But because we've allowed housing to be built in the vicinity of the nuclear power station since it was built, you've got this asymmetry. We had quite a tense discussion with the relevant government department on that, because we said, well, can you revise this and can you do it quickly? And I said 4 years is not quickly, and no, we can do it much more quickly than that. And then when they came back with a consent review, it was 3 years. And so we said, no, that's not fast. This needs to be done now. And so we suggest, well, keep that guidance, but develop new guidance and just be much more permissive. But if we want to build SMRs and advanced modular reactors where they're needed, we're going to need to move at a much greater pace, and we're going to need to remove some of this guidance quite quickly. Similarly, on a lot of the environmental regulation, we've recommended trying to move the property rights essentially to the environmentalists early on in the process. Because at the moment, if you care about the environment, the right strategy for you is just a constant tug of war with the developers of the particular facility to extract as much money and sort concessions out of them, but in a really limited dimension. Whereas actually, if you really care about bats or slow worms or fish and conserving them, actually, if you gave the money to the environmental organizations early on in the process, they would probably spend them on very, very different things if you gave them that choice. So it's trying to change that debate. Let me just turn very quickly to implementation. In writing the report, we spent a lot of time as we formulated our recommendations in October and November, in working with regulators and government departments to get a consensus. The very clear steer from government was that they wanted a report where they could implement all the recommendations. So we worked very hard to understand what the objections would be. It was a little frustrating that then in the last week or two, having done that, lots of government departments seemed to find new objections. And I wrote a rather testy foreword to the report on how difficult it was to get change through in government, because essentially every department has its own priorities. And if the Prime Minister and the Chancellor come along and say, we want this to be a priority, it has to override the existing priorities within the government departments. And this is often why new governments can only really get big change through if they're done just after a general election, where you can actually say to Secretary of State going into the departments, this is a priority for you. So I think a big challenge in implementation is going to be the ability of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to force reprioritization within government departments. Some of what I've seen suggests that government departments are quite open to thinking about that. And I think you look at the strategy that Natural England put out about 2 weeks before our report, that is very much more positive. I think there's a real sense that something has to be done. That, there's a number of think tanks that have done work on high costs of infrastructure. But the UK is building the most expensive trains per kilometre in the world, the most expensive roads if we build them at all, the most expensive other infrastructure, bridges, and so I think this was a bit of a lightning rod for a lot of those projects as well. Personally, I'm not sure that the Prime Minister was very generous about the report in the speech on the 1st of December, but said it should be extended to all of the industrial strategy. I'm in two minds about that, because I'd quite like, I sort of think nuclear is sufficiently specific. It's quite a nice laboratory in which to experiment with some much more radical proposals for how we do things, and to say this matters much more, and particularly on the defence and decommissioning side, where I think trade and cooperation agreement and other similar objections are less relevant. There's an opportunity for us to try and be really bold and experiment with new things. And I think the more you try to apply the same standard across all of infrastructure, the more challenging it might be. But there are a few areas I'm happy to go back to where I think you might also experiment. Let me stop there and discuss this.
I feel like sort of psychologist's couch is going to come out of this as well. Because I actually want to
which of us?
take you back to, as you described it, your testy forward or letter to the Prime Minister, which had absolutely wonderful thing which sort of talked on. You will be told you need time to consider, consult, and dilute. Resist this. I thought it was absolutely wonderful sort of knowing inclusion for a Prime Minister, foreshadowing what he's going to what he's going to get. One of the other things you said in the report, which I think is different to many reviews that have been done before, which was that the review team had to remain engaged and involved in the implementation. Has that happened?
No, it hasn't. So we took as our model the Haddon Cave review, and Haddon Cave recommended, and Haddon Cave's recommendations were implemented, but Haddon Cave recommended an implementation group, and that implementation group was set up before he reported. And that would have been our preference, and that was not done. And I am unclear what mechanism the government is using to hold itself to account on that. That is sort of still unclear. Now, the government has got, I think, an early draft of its implementation plan. It plans to write round, I think, in late January, early February, and presumably it's going to say that in February. But I think it's unclear whether they want somebody that they can control or somebody less controllable. I'm clearly on the less controllable end of the spectrum in their view, yeah, that is one of the things that I think they may regret if they want to move this quickly. They may regret not having done that with more greater resolution.
There's another dreaded phrase that you've just used in there, which for people with experience of government, their hearts will sink, which is, you mentioned that there's going to be a right round on this, which is for those who don't know, this is the way that cabinet government is supposed to work. Proposals go all round government. And your sentence to the Prime Minister, which was a polite way of saying, beware, the rats will come nibbling at these proposals. Right rounds is a very good way that the rats come charging towards any sensible proposal. So give us your sort of sense, your confidence level around implementation. Are there areas where you suspect there will be sort of pushback, or what do your spidey senses tell you?
So I think in the areas of nuclear safety, I'm quite confident a lot of that will happen. I think that for several, because there are several other drivers. I think first of all, within the ONR, there's a real drive for change in the ONR. They sort of get that change needs to happen. There's also the US and sort of global sense that I think a lot of the debates, lots of people argued is that we should attack this thing called the linear non-threshold and some of the other international framework. When we looked at that, we thought, first of all, we didn't have the scientific evidence to make clear conclusions on some of these issues. But secondly, there is quite a lot of work going on in international fora that are addressing that, and those are moving in one direction primarily. So we felt there was quite a lot of momentum there, and the ONR picked up that. Third point I would say is that one of the things that that pushed the Prime Minister, I think, to be very enthusiastic about this was a letter that the chair of the ONR organised all the chairs of the delivery organisations of the industry, so a lot of the Decommissioning Authority, Sizewell, EDF, and many of the others. And they wrote a letter which is now public, or became public very quickly, asking for full implementation. But that was very much driven by the ONR. So the ONR is very much behind this, accepts things need to change. And so I'd be very confident on that front. I think on some of the planning and environmental stuff, it's much more difficult. Yeah. I think by the way, I think the MOD, I think, is very, very keen on the merger of the Defence Nuclear Regulator with the ONR. That's very likely to happen, I would have thought. I think there will be change on environmental. Whether they find their way to enact the full-throated upfront payments, I think it's very close to the direction of travel that DEFRA is on and the government's on that. The other one that's difficult for them is the Aarhus Convention, where I thought our recommendations were modest, but actually the MOJ thought anything but, and thought they were all but leaving, and so we were really surprised by that. Right. So I think there's probably going to be a bit of a battleground on that one. And then I think on some of the planning stuff, there's a tendency to replace one process with another process, and I would. I just like us to, and this goes back to the point about government being decisive. The government says this is what we want to do. We want to build Rolls-Royce SMRs in Wilfer. We're going to have one round of consultation on this, and then we're going to get on with it. We're not going to get ourselves into the horizon situation. we've made a number of recommendations to try and help with that. One is that once a project has begun, any revised laws or regulations should not apply to that project during its lifetime, because that's one of the things that makes life very difficult. Secondly, if there are judicial reviews, the Treasury should underwrite the project not to stop construction, so that the developer is not prevented from stopping construction. That's one of the other big things that has pushed up cost and delay. And thirdly, that where ministers make decisions, we've suggested that they do so in very tight time limits, that the decision is taken as a positive if they don't make the decision in that time limit, and they shouldn't be allowed to reopen consultation unless there's manifestly material new stuff. We saw with Gatwick last year, like the government knew that it wanted to do the Gatwick expansion, and they took that decision in principle in January. But the Secretary had to make an active decision, and it was made in August when everybody was away. And she could have made that decision in February. And so how do you help ministers to make these decisions earlier in the process? Because with the interest costs and capital costs of big nuclear projects, 6 months delay is hugely expensive, and that's not internalized by political decision making. So I think, so some of them I think are on a faster track than others. Yeah. But I get the sense, we put everything on a 2-year timescale. We gave the government 3 months grace, so 2 years sort of begins in March. But we were quite considered about how long we thought each recommendation would take. Yeah. And there's now a very nice tracker by Centre for British Progress, which I disclose I'm on the advisor to, but I had nothing to do with this. But they've got a tracker where they're tracking all the recommendations, but it turns out that AI tracks them quite well too. So.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack in. So let's go back to actually the strategic case for nuclear, which you set out very clearly: energy security, net zero, economic growth, and obviously defence, national security. You'd think so clearly identified, articulated, and probably there are a large number of speeches out there, including some being made by ministers, which echo that strategic imperative, but yet that strategic imperative isn't translating into sort of immediate implementation and effect. I mean, are we overstating the case for nuclear? Is it that people don't get it? Are we not making the argument well enough for those who think? Are the gains not there? Help me understand why isn't this happening?
So I think the best example of why we're not overstating it is actually the nuclear deterrent. Like, the nuclear deterrent is above budget and behind time on delivery. And I don't know very many people, there's a small minority of people, I don't know very many people who don't think that's become more important strategically in the current world. And yet we're unable to, I know you do work in Barrow, but we're unable to develop the site at Barrow to expand the site at Barrow because we found some slow worms or whatever it was, and it's holding the whole thing up. Outside of nuclear, the Oxford-Cambridge line is being held up by 34 badgers, and we cull badgers in other parts of the country, but we're protecting them there. So the strategic imperative is I don't think it's overstated. Like, we've just basically are unable to deliver the strategic imperative in a competent way. That's the problem. On decommissioning, and we've made suggestions that we think could take 15 to 30 billion off the decommissioning bill. That seems like quite an important number. We put that number in because we thought it might be helpful to the Chancellor with the OBR if they were able to document it at a future stage, that it might give some upside freedom in other areas. And then on new build, like, if all of the government's plans come out on time, we're building something like 12 gigawatts. We're going to have 12 gigawatts of nuclear, but we need 25. And we know that now. And we know how long it takes. So it's an argument to getting on with it and doing it faster. So, like, a decision on, and by the way, one of the biggest problems that we had with Hinkley was not any local opposition to Hinkley, but the power lines. Yeah. But we know that we have a problem with the grid separately. Yeah. But actually, we have grid connections to lots of places, from Wintford in Dorset to Heysham. And we should be thinking how we're using those grid connections, and we should be thinking, but like I couldn't understand why the government took so long to announce Anglesey as a site. Like the local MP and local community is very enthusiastic. We have a grid line into it. But it took like 3 years to announce that as the location. So I just think, I don't think we're overstating the strategic imperative. I just think there's a lot of indecisiveness about getting on with it. And that's very frustrating.
I think there'll be many people in this room who echo that it's very frustrating line. One of the key recommendations was about future regulator, a commission for nuclear regulation. Let me go back to a point you made in your opening, which was actually, it's not often the regulators that are the obstacle. It's the legislation that underpins. So how do we set up a new commission for nuclear regulation? How do we set them up for success?
So first, just to unpack for people, the idea behind the commission is not to change the existing regulatory apparatus. I formed the view reasonably early on doing this that the last thing we needed was a regulatory rearrangement that would delay everything. There was a lot of strength in what the regulators are doing. However, there was not enough escalation and there was not enough coordination between different regulators and not enough decisiveness on getting things done. And arguably, not enough public engagement sometimes on you're bringing everybody with you. So the idea behind the commission is it's a very light structure that'll sit across all of the relevant regulatory bodies and be just a one-stop shop for making decisions. So it'll just have concurrent powers with all of the regulators. And so it'll be a commission of 5 people. They should have some defense expertise. And essentially they're just like, almost like a court, like a decision-making body that the decisions get escalated to. And then within ONR, within the Environment Agency and the various other regulators. By the way, there's a big gap in our report on Scottish and Welsh environmental regulation because it wasn't part of our mandate. There's also, security was not part of our mandate, so there's 1 or 2 issues there. But essentially, you want a one-stop body that potentially has public hearings, but then just makes decisions, and you build escalation in through that. And that's the essential idea behind it. What we recommended was that the ONR and Environment Agency work together to set it up, go as far as they can without statute, in a shadow form over the next 2 years, so as to inform precisely how it would look. And just going back to something I said at the beginning, it's difficult in 6 months to write down a complete model of what this would look like, which is why I was very keen that there be an implementation structure to actually examine it in more detail. But I think rather than tear up what we currently have, it's about trying to make that work better in a more coordinated way. And essentially the 2 problems we saw within the regulators were people at junior levels in regulators taking very different decisions than their bosses would have made if that decision had been known to them. And secondly, the people across the regulators not speaking to each other. And then everybody says, oh, well, every industry leader I meet says, I have so many different regulators in my industry. But actually, each of those regulators has an important function. And so the important thing for regulators is actually not to think we should merge all the regulators. Like merging all the regulators to face the water industry means you won't have all the regulators to face the energy industry. It's quite difficult to organize that unless you have one regulator for everything. So what you have to do is to try and get the regulators facing a particular sector to work more closely together. So the commission is about trying to pull that together.
I'd like to come on to culture, which features very heavily in the report. And also, I mean, the attitude towards risk and culture. I think often some of the things you're describing about why delays happen in government decision making in this area is often to do with the fact that there's risk involved and somebody somewhere doesn't want to take any, or they just want to keep reducing it to 0, which, as your report says, is sort of inherently impossible. So how do we change the the culture which would stretch across government, regulators and industry to move towards the right balance between pace and outcomes whilst maintaining safety. It's a big challenge.
So part of this is general in our society and economy, and part of it is very specific to nuclear. The part that's general about our society is best illustrated by, when I was doing this in early October, it was a very windy day, and the Royal Parks closed all the parks, and I was cycling back into Regent's Park, and everybody was walking around the edge of the park. Now, trees are more likely to fall on you where there's a gap rather than in the park. So all they'd done was move the risk to the perimeter of the park. And then I was talking to somebody senior from the health and safety executive as part of the report, and just before the meeting I was saying that I was quite amused by this, and she said to me, it drives us crazy because people blame us. We haven't said this. We would much prefer them to keep the park open and have a risk-based approach, but the companies are risk averse. The Royal Parks is risk averse. So actually, there's this whole self-censorship that goes on inside companies that are basically adopt approaches that transfer risk to other places, but minimize their own liability. So that's part of a general culture we have towards risk in our society at the moment. And it's driven by victims who, when something happens, want more regulation because whatever happened to them. But we can't live in a world in which nobody can ever die of anything. But that's sort of what some people want. So we have a problem with that generally, and that's quite a big and serious problem. And there's not enough debate about it. But I'm probably not the only person in the room who screams at the Today program every morning because it's a parade of people calling for regulation to do things that are very costly, but actually are not necessarily going to change anything other than a very, very narrow risk. Then within nuclear, there's a number of very specific issues. So one is the whole issue of safety cases. So the whole industry around safety cases, in which people have got to the view that the bigger the safety case, the better it is. And we're very, very clear on this. The bigger the safety case, the worse it is. Because the bigger it is, the more stuff is in there that you can't find and that you don't know, and you're just burying stuff there. And so we've made a number of recommendations for basically paring back safety cases, paring back the industry to the safety cases, and the whole sort of use of artificial risk protection, which actually is just using process to say, well, we've done everything we possibly done, rather than judgment. Related to that, and relates to the culture point, there's not enough people in the industry with senior experience, what is called a SQEP, SQEP, which is an industry term that I had not come across before, but seriously qualified and educated. Is it educated person? Experienced persons. Pardon? Suitably qualified. You see, what happens is when you use these acronyms long enough, you forget what the original terms were. Semi-urban population density criteria. I'm dyslexic, so I'm hopeless with acronyms. But I learned a lot of them in the last year. And there's a whole taxonomy at the end of the report. But there are not enough senior people. But we saw examples when we went around and met the various industries of senior people who were taking judgments inside the businesses and saying to the ONR, we're not going to spend 94 million on this project because it's going to save one life over 50 years in expected value terms, and that is not appropriate expenditure, and we're not going to do it. But we saw far more examples where people were not prepared to do that and not prepared to challenge back. And actually, when people did challenge back into the ONR, they often got very good results, but not enough of them are doing it. Yeah. There's also a sense. There were certainly historical examples. I don't think, to be fair to the ONR, we've heard very recent ones where inspectors at ground level, so relatively junior, said to people, if you raise this as an issue, if you escalate this, we will see you again. Like, we haven't gone away. And so there was a threat of retribution. And then, because there are requirements for companies to be, the sort of suitability regime, a bit like financial regulation for the people running companies, there's a real sense that if you raise too many issues, you'll be seen as not having the right mindset towards safety and other issues. So there's a number of different factors in here, but essentially we have to move to a situation where we have more more senior and experienced people making the right challenging judgments, and a regulator that is open to that challenge and welcomes it. Because what's happened is that there's a boundary of what is safe, and we're just way inside it. And it works like a ratchet, and then every time somebody accepts a decision, it works again. And the final point I would say is that the as low as reasonably practical standard has been taken way too far. And the example I used on the Today programme when I was talking about this was, at 70 miles an hour on the motorway, you can argue that it would be safer at 60, and it would be. But at 60, you can make the same argument, and at 50, you can make the same argument. And when you get to 5 miles an hour, you've lost, you've got very safe on the motorway, but you've lost the sense of what the purpose of the motorway was for. And we have lost the sense of what the purpose is for in a lot of what we're doing. The purpose is to build things quickly and efficiently. And that gets, when it's combined with some of the nuclear safety stuff, it just becomes particularly problematic. So I think there's a wholesale reset of the culture needed. And I think the regulator is very keen to lead on that, but it's why I think the letter we wanted the Chancellor to write to the companies is also a very important part of that, because nothing I saw at the most senior levels of companies suggested that the audit committees in those companies were really were anything other than quite risk averse about nuclear. It's a dangerous thing in a box over here, and we let a local committee deal with it. I think they need to be much more engaged with it at a corporate level.
I've got a couple more questions I was going to ask, and then I'll come to the room and come online. So sharpen your questions now. The change that you've described, it's a pretty enormous change, and in the end, one of the things that matters most to make that change happen is the right sort of leadership. Do we have it? And if we don't, how do we get it?
I think we probably, do you mean political leadership or leadership within the industry?
You can take the question to any direction you choose. I was going to give you a bit of wiggle room.
So let me give it a number of levels. So I think within the regulators, the leadership of the regulators really are up for change. And even if you look at the strategy of Natural England that was published in November, Tony Juniper is leading Natural England to think differently about some of these issues. So I think there's a lot of good leadership out there on the ground. I think within the industry, I think there are many good leaders, but I do think they could do more to check a lot of the egregious risk aversion that happens under them. I think within the civil service, I think the civil service have been very battered by a lot of change in political leadership over the last 10 years, and I think I've met lots of civil servants who are really keen to get things done, but the civil service is often used to manage so many different stakeholder groups without clear political direction that is a big problem. And so I think I've been pleased that there has been greater political leadership around this than I've seen on other issues, but the test is going to be in the continuity of that political leadership over time. Like the two statements the Prime Minister made were great, but he and his department, and number 10, are going to push that really, really hard to get it delivered. But in defence and in energy, ministers have been very keen, and I think the Patrick Vallance is leading in DESNES, and that gives me a lot of confidence as well. So there's a lot of leadership there. I think if it gets the right momentum behind it politically, it can deliver.
There are a few people in the room who are actually currently serving civil servants who would otherwise have stayed anonymous, except for their nodding at that point you made about the challenge of sometimes working in that environment. My final question is about the history of this, and there's a few professional and amateur historians, especially around nuclear matters, in the room. And I have to say, your report actually almost brought me close to tears. You think of the nation that hosted Rutherford, Chadwick, Tube Alloys, Calder Hall, Operation Grapple, that unbelievable spirit of can-do, working at the very edge of the knowledge of science and testing engineering. and then you read your report, which just basically is 163 pages of excuses we've made for ourselves over the last 50 years for why things haven't happened. How did we get there? But crucially, how do we make sure we don't ever go back to that?
I mean, that's a that's a very broad question to ask. I do think, I mean, if I can, when we were having the Brexit debate, I remember thinking, being Irish, living here, I remember thinking, it's very convenient to blame the European Union for all the regulation we have in Britain, but actually we quite like regulation here. And I do a lot of work with Australia, and I think maybe there might be one or two Australians in the audience, but Australia loves regulation. It's not in the European Union. There's something about the culture in this country that we like regulation. The example I used to use was the way in which, if you go to Paris, there's motorbikes spread all over the pavements. But in Britain, it's not just that we have motorbike parking bays, but we also charge for the motorbike parking. Whereas in France, it's sort of free for all. So there's something about the regulated mindset in this country that's grown and grown and grown over the last 20 or 30 years. And so I think the domestic demand for more regulation in this country is much stronger than people like to admit. I think it's part of a British mindset.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, particularly perhaps in the context of where you've got perceived state failure. And you mentioned the sort of government by inquiry and all those sorts of things which drive you down this route.
Yeah. But an example that I'll just give from completely outside this area, but I was on the board of Innovate UK and UKRI for quite a while, and we had a really great program under the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund on drones in extreme environments back in 2017 to 2019. But you couldn't fly a drone out of line of sight, and most extreme environments tend to be out of line of sight. And so the Civil Aviation Authority got blamed a bit, but actually it was the fundamental laws under which the Civil Aviation Authority were operating was the problem. And nothing happened on it, and still very little has happened on it. It's beginning to happen now. But in that period, drones have become the mainstay of war in Ukraine and many other conflicts. You saw even with Syria last year, the strategic role that drones play. There was a lack of, I think, strategic vision back in 2018, 2019 to think these might be important. And this regulation might be getting the balance wrong between extreme risk aversion on risk to commercial aircraft being hit by a drone, and so having a complete ban. And we're getting there now, but it's been 5 years, and some of these things are very fast moving, and we should be much faster on them. And it's very depressing that we're not able to escalate those debates to the right level. I think that is a problem. And so you mentioned Rutherford and others, but there's a lot of really, really great research happening in this country. Dave Willits is chairing the Regulatory Innovation Office. Well, one of the big problems we have is we've lots of great scientists doing work, but actually we have a lot of regulation blocking that coming to market, and that's a really significant problem. So I think the work the Regulatory Innovation Office is doing needs to be developed further, because we need to be much, much stronger as an economy on bringing innovative technologies to market than we are at the moment.
Very good. Right, enough from me. Let me come in. Oh, good. We've got lots of questions. So I'll just sort of work my way along the room. Should we start with Charlotte? Oh, sorry. I should ask you to introduce yourself before you ask your question. Oh, there is a microphone. And I've got at least one question online, which I've noted, and I'll come to Joseph.
Thank you very much, both. That was absolutely fascinating. And my name's Charlotte, Baroness Veer. I work for Core Power. We do nuclear and maritime, putting reactors on ships for shipping and energy generation. However, I'm not going to ask about that at all. One phrase which was not mentioned today, so I was also a minister for years in transport and in the Treasury, and no one's mentioned the Treasury. And if I could say one thing in my experience of trying to get roads approved and trying to get anything done, and having seen it from the other side, and you spoke about the political decision-making and the delays, and Simon's laughing, and I think he's blushing a bit at this point, is it ever the fault of the Treasury?
It might be, but it's not a regulatory question. But I will say that we did make some private recommendations back in the defence area, and some of those were aimed at the Treasury and how the Treasury funds some of this. So yes, there are some issues in there, but there were ones I didn't really want to go into publicly, but certainly in the defence area, we've made some sharp recommendations to the Treasury.
I'm not going to answer the... let's go here, and then I'll come down that side. Yeah, the second row. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. It was excellent talk. Robert Craig, University of Bristol. I wanted to press you on a report that I wrote for Policy Exchange in November, because you mentioned two things that jumped out to me. You said the MOJ's reaction to the Aarhus Convention was an interesting one, and you mentioned the Nuclear Commission could be like a court. And I'm just wondering if you thought that there was any mileage in at least some of the process being put into a private act of parliament which the Aarhus Convention has held is a valid public authority for compliance purposes, which would then expedite potentially the approvals for things like DCOs, etc., through a private act of parliament. And secondly, whether or not the Commission could actually be a court with an ouster clause that stopped it being judicially reviewed because of the risk of that Commission itself being judicially reviewed.
We didn't consider the first question, but it's worthy of consideration. And on the second question, my thinking was that if the ONR and the EA and others were coming together and providing evidence, and we've built in devil's advocates and other challenges into that process, and external people provide evidence, not that commission might not be judicially reviewable, but actually that the court would give quite a lot of deference to the decision of a commission that was more of a deliberative body, that was not the body that was doing the actual inspection and investigation. And so there are good examples of that. So in my own area, although the government's about to dismantle it, the second pair of eyes panels at what was the Monopolies Emergency Commission, then the Competition Commission, is now the CMA, but it's about to be disbanded by, published last week in a consultation paper, but a second pair of eyes, so that the phase one of the CMA started the investigation, phase two is judicial review only. I cannot think of any examples where the substantive decision was overturned and the judicial reviews were usually very fast. So that was sort of slightly the model we were aiming off.
Thank you. I'm going to take two more in the room, go to one online, and then I'll take three more in the question. So do you want to go to Julian and Marie just there?
Julian Brazier, RUSI, and Defence Minister a long time ago. Observation and a question. Observation, one area where there is quite a lot of very positive risk taken is the Science Research Councils, because they're subject to a much lower regulatory regime than their counterparts spending money on science in the MOD. My question is, you said quite a lot about the problem with the deterrent and how serious it is, the way it's overrunning and running slowly and so on. The American system, whereby they produce successive deterrents run by the Department of Energy and not, with the nuclear program run by the Department of Energy and not by the Pentagon, do you think there's anything to look at there?
Let me get Anne-Marie's question as well, so you don't take them to...
Thank you. First of all, John, thank you for your report. It was a breath of fresh air for those of us who, in my case, I was the Energy Minister of Net Zero Strategy, I was Defence Minister, trying to shift the dial on nuclear deterrence. I had a number of portfolios post-Brexit to try and drive some of this regulation change. The challenges were that immediately in our wonderful country, where everybody's voice is important, regulators sat behind those who choose to advocate against change. A number of things that we attempted and failed to do, in my view, was to change the JR review framework to a much shorter time frame, to ask the insurance companies to help, to your point, companies take more risk. Is the only way to really shift this at the pace you absolutely rightly identify, to legislate across the board in a big piece of regulatory change to strip away those opportunities to find obfuscation?
Yeah, on the first question, I mean, we were not asked to look at the delivery model of the MOD, but to look at the regulatory aspects. And there are about 8 regulators in the MOD that affect nuclear delivery, and that is a big part of the problem. But I'll make one observation. I mean, I had not much interaction with the MOD before this. I had some when I was at the Office of Fair Trading. But I was very struck with the MOD that the quality of the individuals was superb, but the outcome of all of them working together was pretty poor. I've never seen an organization where that disconnect is as great. And so there's something severely dysfunctional in the delivery model of the MOD as I saw it. But it's not about the individuals. The individuals were first rate. But there were a lot of really bad decisions coming out of it, and individuals who felt powerless, who really cared about it but felt powerless to stop. So there's a bigger issue about that, but that wasn't my remit, and it was just an observation. On your question, Marie, I don't know if that is the answer. It's appealing at a high level, but I think the problem is that when you begin to look at each individual area of regulation, you discover there's individual details on them. I do think there's a really interesting question about the role of liability insurance as a way of moving some of the risk away. I also think if I look at what we do across another area I know a lot about is consumer protection. If you're a consumer, your protection in financial services is basically, it's like you walk in a space with padded walls. But if you're then buying an airplane ticket or a railway ticket, there's quite sharp edges. And so as a consumer, you don't know what your rights are. And so I think we could do a lot more to try and establish clarity about where boundaries of individual responsibility start and where corporate responsibility ends. And that's all over the place. That's probably where I would start, to say, actually, can we just clarify that a little bit more so that we're clear on what my responsibility is as a citizen or as a consumer to protect myself, and what the company's liability is towards me. And I think that's so confused across the piece that I would probably start by trying to codify that a little more clearly.
Very good. I'm going to come online. I'm not entirely sure how this works, whether the voice appears. Right, brilliant. In which case, let me come to Joseph. I don't know if this is a question about the Wildlife Trusts or whether Joseph is from the Wildlife Trusts. If you don't know, Wildlife Trusts at the moment are trying to mobilise their members to take a close look at the work that the Commission has done, the recommendations. Joseph, are you there?
Hello, can people hear me?
Yeah, we've got you, Joseph. Go ahead.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This has been a really interesting discussion. John, you mentioned about you didn't necessarily agree with sort of extending the findings to sort of other forms of infrastructure projects. Could you possibly sort of expand on that? And then secondly, as Simon outlined, we've outlined some concerns with some of the evidence raised on the nature section of the review. Would you be open to meeting with us to discuss that in further detail?
Yeah. So on the latter, yes. I mean, we did meet with the Wildlife Trust when we were putting this together. In fact, we specifically went out and asked to meet the Wildlife Trust because we wanted to hear that voice in the review. But yeah, we can have the debate about the policy evidence. I'm pretty sure that how we've expressed it in the report is accurate. On the other projects, there are two or three things where if the government wanted to experiment with doing something bolder, where I think it could be, I think it might be useful to experiment. One is the building of reservoirs. One of the interesting things about reservoirs and wildlife is that when a reservoir is built, it has a big biodiversity gain. When a nuclear power station is built, it is quite a big biodiversity gain because people are generally not that close to it, and nature thrives without people. And we don't take account of that enough within the system. So there's an opportunity to test that with the two reservoirs that are first online. And then the other two big strategic programs the government has, the Oxcam Railway and the expansion of Heathrow, are the other cases where you might want to experiment. But the reason why I wasn't sure that I would want to do this everywhere at the moment is that I think from a policy development point of view, it is useful to experiment with radical proposals. And those radical proposals, we might in 10 years' time look back and say, well, actually, John Fingleton was very optimistic that would be good for the environment and good for building, but he was wrong. And that might happen. But I'd like to have that experiment. At the moment, we just don't have that experiment. So I want to have the experiment where we test the limits on both sides of the argument. And so where we build fast and we do novel things, and then we ask ourselves, was that an environmental disaster? I suspect it won't be, but I could be proved wrong on that. But that's a more compelling argument for me to make if it's happening in a limited range of areas. And so I think that was part of my mindset in making that recommendation. And I was very persuaded by the environmental evidence we heard. And a lot of the numbers we put in the report, I think, would have led to about a tripling of the amount of money going into environmental protection just from nuclear. So I think we should be putting more. I mean, I came out of this thinking we could be putting a lot more money into environmental protection than we're putting in. And at the moment, a lot of it's going into concrete and lawyers' pockets when it could be going into people who really care about species and ecosystems and international SSI sites. So I just wanted to move the debate on from that rather than necessarily come down on one side or the other, but argue that we were nowhere near the frontier.
It's very interesting the point you talked generally about experimentation. You flagged a number of weaknesses of the British state and the way we govern ourselves. Actually, experiment, testing and learning is something we are nationally allergic to. When we go out and we do something, traditionally we need to be 100% positive that this is absolutely the right thing to do and there's no doubt. So the idea of experimentation, I think, is quite a novel and challenging concept. There were two people who wanted to ask questions down here at the front. I wonder if I just ask you to just do your questions very briefly and I'll get John to do a quick answer if they haven't already been covered. Okay.
Hi, thank you very much. David Blackman, representing Utility Week magazine. Just interested in when you're talking about implementation, and you already referenced the semi-urban population density criteria. I think I've got that right. Is that something you're hopeful will see be implemented by the government? And are you disappointed that I think it wasn't taken forward in the national policy statement that was published at the end of last year? Are you disappointed that it hasn't been embraced more readily by the government?
We can take the other one, which was just the other end of the row, and then we'll...
Hi, Tess Colley. I'm an environmental journalist. I was going to ask a similar question to the Wildlife Trusts, but as additionally, are you actually being consulted on the rollout of your recommendations to other parts of the industrial strategy at all? Just more broadly, I mean, I know the Wildlife Trusts have said that there are flaws and inaccuracies in your report. I know you said you meet them, but could I get a bit more from you on what you think about that?
So on the semi-urban population density criteria, I'm reasonably confident there will be change. We can't deliver the nuclear program unless we change it. When you look at the sort of map of the UK and you get the population density and then you put airfields and the rules on how close a nuclear power station can be to an airfield and you put other restrictions down, there's almost nowhere where we can build. And so something has to give, and that's the one that I think is easiest to give. So I'm confident. What I'm not sure is how long it will take, but I'm confident that will change because we can't deliver the program. On your question, so I think the Wildlife Trust was particularly has taken issue with the numbers we've given around the fish deterrent at Hinckley. There are two different terms being used. There's the acoustic deterrent, which is the £50 million extra bit, but the 700 million consists of 500 million for an intake pipe and 150 million for an outflow pipe for fish. And both of those have elements of protecting fish. So it's not just the 50 million acoustic deterrent. And we're very clear about that in the report. A lot of the other cost is to do with saving fish. Second observation I would make is that we think there's an important difference to be made between rare species. And so actually the Wildlife Trust and Natural England, when they came to see us, were very persuasive on the fact that, for example, salmon in the Severn are a unique species. And if you damage salmon in the Severn, you damage them forever. They're not going to be easily recovered. But that then got me thinking, if I'm somebody who cares about salmon in the Severn and I have a lot of money to spend, is Hinckley where I would spend it, or would I spend it on other things? And people have very, very strong differing views on that. All I'm doing is saying, let's give the money to the people who care about salmon in the Severn and ask them, where do you want to spend it? Do you want to spend it on Hinckley, or do you want to spend it on agricultural runoff and weirs in the Severn, where would be most effective for protecting those species? So I'm just trying to move the debate to asking that question in a slightly different way and involve a broader range of stakeholders in answering it, rather than saying I know what the right answer is. But unfortunately, the process doesn't allow us to ask that question at the moment. So I would approach this from the point of view of we have a serious environmental degradation problem. We need to put money and effort into restoring and preserving those. But we should be talking to the people who are working on the ground on the individual species and asking them, if you had more money, what would you be doing? And then making that comparative assessment. And that's not about saying just simply we're going to pay to pollute or whatever, which is an expression I hate, but it's just asking a bigger question: how do we most effectively protect the environment? So there's a useful debate to be had there, but I do think there's probably a net gain for the environment and for infrastructure to be had.
John, a huge thanks for spending the last hour doing that rarest of things, which is to a complicated subject, bringing reason and strategic thought, if only there was more of it. We are incredibly grateful to you for coming along today to share all of your insights. So thank you very much. And thank you all for coming in person and